The anti-war movement made itself felt in a number of ways. Individuals holding teach-ins at universities, returning veterans found themselves criticized and called names by individuals who opposed the war. Members of the anti-war movement burned their draft cards, fled to Canada. Others protested in the streets. Public opinion polls showed growing opposition to the war. If you look at the graph on the slide here, look at that red line. That red line represents the percentage of Americans who believed it was a mistake to send US troops to Vietnam. If you notice, during 1967, that number is going up and up. And that pessimism, that concern about how the war was going, increased even further as a result of the Tet Offensive of 1968. The Tet Offensive was a joint North Vietnamese Army Viet Cong offensive against South Vietnam that had two purposes. The first was to create a rebellion in the South that would overthrow the government there. And the second was to try to break the will of the American people, to undermine any will the American people had to continue this war. The offensive began in late January of 1968, with dozens of positions throughout South Vietnam being hit. By the time it ended 4 weeks later, it was in at least two respects a disaster for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. First of all, there was no uprising against the South's government. Second of all, the Viet Cong lost anywhere from 30 to 40,000 members, 30 to 40,000 of their number in South Vietnam. That was a sizable proportion of the Viet Cong strength in South Vietnam. So the Viet Cong had taken a hit. Compare that to the 3,300 Americans and South Vietnamese who were killed. So again, the Viet Cong took far more losses. But in other respects, the Tet Offensive was anything but a success for the United States. For one thing, American journalists who were embedded with the US military reported what was happening during the Tet Offensive. And so Americans watching the nightly news could witness what was occurring in almost real time. During the Tet Offensive, the highly esteemed US anchorman, Walter Cronkite, said, "What the hell is going on? I thought we were winning the war." After Cronkite said that, Lyndon Johnson reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost middle America. In short, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost American public opinion." And pictures and video of the incident you see pictured here didn't help matters. Pictures and video of South Vietnam's national police chief killing a Viet Cong prisoner. Americans, as a result, asked themselves, this is who we're supporting? A government that kills prisoners in cold blood? Public opinion began to turn even more against the war. By March of 1968, an overwhelming 78% of Americans said we're not making progress in Vietnam. And again, look at the graph, look at the red line, and you will see that by the time of the Tet Offensive, about half of Americans now believed it was a mistake to send US troops to Vietnam, more than believed it was not a mistake. Johnson, meanwhile, watched his political fortunes fall. In March of 1968, realizing he had no chance for winning another term in office, he told the American people he would not run for re-election. In that same speech, he offered negotiations with North Vietnam. Now, this was not the first time he offered to talk with the North. He had offered previously on a number of occasions, but the two sides could not agree on terms of a settlement. Now, in March of 1968, he offers negotiations again, and this time the North Vietnamese said we're prepared to talk. Those talks began in Paris later that year, but they quickly again bogged down over terms of a settlement. One other impact of Tet was that it led the Johnson administration to begin a process that became known as Vietnamization, a process by which the United States would gradually pull its troops out of South Vietnam, and as we did so, gradually turn the war effort over to the South Vietnamese, allow them to fight their own war. Well, when when election day came around in 1968, it was Richard Nixon who won those elections. Richard Nixon won in part because he ran on a campaign in which he said he would end the Vietnam War with honor. In other words, I'm going to end the Vietnam War, but not in a way that makes it look like we lost. Now, to win, or at least end the Vietnam War honorably, Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, had a multi-part plan. First of all, offer inducements to the Chinese and Soviets to pressure North Vietnam to end the war. Say to the Chinese, for instance, we're willing to offer you economic incentives, trade incentives, if you'll put pressure on the North to end the war. Tell the Soviets, we know you want to talk about arms control. We're prepared to do that if you'll put pressure on North Vietnam to end the war. Second of all, they intensified the bombing of North Vietnam, and they expanded the bombing campaign to include Cambodia, which up to that point had been off limits. The idea here being that this will bring additional pressure to bear on North Vietnam. And last but not least, to continue the policy of Vietnamization, to continue this policy of gradually pulling our troops out of the South, the hope being here that that would please the anti-war movement. Well, the Nixon-Kissinger strategy had a number of problems. First of all, the Soviet Union and China proved unwilling to help. Second of all, South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu, as had been the case with his predecessors, tended to appoint military commanders for reasons of loyalty more than for reasons of merit. This is not to say there weren't good units in the South Vietnamese army. There were. Indeed, during the Tet Offensive, some South Vietnamese units fought very well. But even US intelligence said in 1968 that in looking at the South Vietnamese army, there were strong questions as to whether that army would be in a position to defend South Vietnam on its own once the US had pulled out. A third problem was that anti-war agitation continued, and that opposition to the war exploded in 1970. In March of 1970, without telling most members of Congress and without telling the US public, Nixon ordered 30,000 US and 50,000 South Vietnamese troops into Cambodia to destroy Viet Cong bases there. When those troops returned to South Vietnam, the United States claimed to have destroyed large amounts of food and ammunition used by the enemy. Nixon then announced this offensive after the fact, and it caused an uproar in the country, protests throughout the United States, including at college campuses. By far the most famous of those protests took place at Kent State University in Ohio. During the protest, National Guardsmen opened fire on the crowd, killing 4 individuals. What happened at Kent State led to even more unrest in the United States, more protests, millions of students demonstrating at colleges and universities. In some cases, the demonstrations were so intense that those colleges and universities simply shut down for the remainder of the school year.